have good posture.
If we have good posture, hold on. Hi, my baby.
You're so tolerant. She's so tolerant.
Welcome to Bridging the Tiber, where we talk about faith issues from the perspective of being in an inter-ecclesial marriage.
Yeah.
My name is Meredith O'Connor, and this is my husband.
Larry O'Connor. And I'm Catholic, and she's not.
That's right. I'm a Baptist, a Southern Baptist,
She's a
actually.
Protestant. She's constantly protesting. I lived my entire life with somebody protesting.
Right. So I'm a Southern Baptist in the Reformed tradition. And today we are going to be...
You're so tolerant of me. I really appreciate it.
Can I get through this?
Yes, go.
And today we're going to be talking about what to do when someone that you love doesn't believe the same things as you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be specific, this is our chance to sort of give advice, because people say, would you recommend this? This is how we left them hanging on the last episode.
It's true.
People said, would you recommend this for other people? And now we're going to tell you whether this is recommended or not.
Yeah.
Whether our entire life choice, the most important choice that we've made in our life, is something that you should do too. Whether this entire marriage is one big mistake.
That's not. That's the wrong framing.
This is the YouTube opportunity for my wife to tell me she regrets marrying me.
That's not what this will be.
Lord,
but we should address the fact that this conversation isn't actually, despite how casual this opening has been, this conversation has been several hours in the making, even of what you're seeing right now. We've had to practice this conversation several times.
Well, I wouldn't say we practiced it.
Well,
but
yes. To get to how we talk to each other now has taken a lot of repetition of talking to each other well.
Right. There were a few moments where we were, expressing our feelings, and we realized, wait a minute, I don't want to say that. That came out wrong. Hold on,
right.
I'm sorry. Wait.
Right.
Don't take that the wrong way.
And that's something that I wanted to sort of highlight, because a lot of people really point out how well we talk to each other, and that's because we practice talking to each other well. and we are very honest with each other when we don't like how we're expressing things to each other.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want to give the impression that if you see us talk about this well now, that came supernaturally. That took practice.
Yeah.
And practice talking to each other well. So that would be, I think, our first bit of advice, is to practice talking to each other about these things and actually do it over and over again. And don't expect that the first time that you talk to someone that you deeply love and yet deeply disagree with, that it's going to go super well the first time.
Right.
It takes practice.
But it's important to have this foundation of like, listen, all right, we're going to talk about something, and it's something that's really important to both of us, and we already know that we don't agree on it. So as we just understand, if I say something the wrong way, or if you hear it the wrong way, or read intention into my words that weren't actually there, just, a fountain of grace, please, on all of this, because the fundamental foundation is that I love you. And I'm not saying something because I'm trying to be hurtful or I'm trying to make things awkward. I'm saying things because this is the language that I know to use, and now I'm asking you to help me get to a different point with it. Does that make sense?
Right.
I hope that makes sense.
And help the person across from you know how they're being heard by you. And that might be how they're communicating it, and that might just be how you're hearing it. And so it takes a lot of practice. And there's been years of conversations in the making for us to disagree well.
That said, a lot of times we don't know what we're going to say when we start rolling. So like in our last episode.
Yeah, that one was much more freewheeling than what I thought it was going to be.
But again, we sort of know what our ground rules are and stuff like that, I hope.
I think so.
Yeah.
We'll find out.
But that's why, and by the way, that's why I was joking when I said she's a Protestant, constantly protesting. It's like, I recognize that to be called Protestant is not always the most flattering way to describe one's faith. That was a joke.
It is a joke. Okay, so we're going to talk about one thing that people constantly approach us with, and that is, I have fallen in love with somebody who is in a different ecclesial community. Can this work?
Yeah.
Will it work like yours works? And so
the way people come to me, like, hey, I'm dating this girl, and she's checking all the boxes. I mean, everything's there. It's great, and I met her, and da-da-da. There's this one thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a big thing. Don't pretend it's not a big thing.
Right. So I would say that our advice on this, we sort of narrowed it down to a couple of different categories because our advice would be different depending on the stage of life and the circumstances. And I will also say for people who know us, we are going to be presenting this for people who we do not know, who we have not had the ability to ask a bunch of questions to and know about you. If you want to, if you know us and want to know our opinion, then just ask us directly. But don't necessarily take this video as commentary on yourselves. This is very much set in the context of we don't know you. So in general, this is our
This is
how we would
everybody's
view it.
situation is different.
Everyone's
But
situation
you know
is different, but
we want to know you. So why don't you reach out and let us know your specific issues, and we're going to help you through this process. Just put it in the comments down below, and we'll
maybe
we'll
address it in a future episode. Anyway.
All right.
So
where do we begin?
I would say let's begin with later stage of life things. So one of the ones that we both have encountered is somebody who converted after marriage. So they, doing life together, were in the same ecclesial community, and then one person's convictions changed.
Yeah. So let's say you're both nominal Christians, let's say one person is pretty dedicated to their specific faith, and the other person is, well, sure, yeah, that's fine with me. And then suddenly, years later, wait a minute, I've had this new revelation.
Right, or just a new religious fervor, and that has led them to a different ecclesial community. That is really difficult.
Yeah.
Our first thing that I think we would both say is that your commitment is to your marriage. I cannot imagine unless a person was falling away from Christ in general and leading you to sin, and gave you biblical grounds for divorce. Outside of that, your commitment is to your marriage.
Yeah, you got to figure it out.
You got to figure it out.
You got to make it work.
You've got to figure it out.
It was easy. This would be the shortest video in the world where we, your wife converted to baptism and isn't Catholic anymore. Well, divorce that woman. She's right. That's over. That's right there, right? No. Or the other way around. It's like no. Now now's where the homework comes in.
Right. So, one of our advice that we were talking about is that the first thing that you should do is look in the mirror and recognize your own nominalism, recognize your own shortcomings that have maybe led to a point to where somebody converted, and repent of that. And then, you're in covenant of marriage.
This has happened because I haven't been strong enough in my faith, because I haven't communicated enough how critically important this is. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's more about how you just need to look in the mirror first before you're pointing fingers at the other person.
Always a good idea. That transcends this discussion, by the way. It also involves, cleaning up the kitchen.
It's just important that a lot of people feel hurt or betrayed. That's certainly something that we've encountered whenever people have brought this to us and asked us for advice on this, on how an inter-ecclesial marriage works. They're just really hurt and they feel very betrayed whenever their partner converts. And you start asking some questions and you realize that typically both, but at least one of them, was kind of nominal and wasn't necessarily living out their faith in all areas of their life. And, there were gaps in the knowledge of their faith. And which is the heart of a lot of conversion stories, right? I heard something I had never heard before. You hear that all the time, whether it's people converting from Catholicism to Protestantism or Protestantism to Catholicism. And so it's important to recognize where your own shortcomings were in the study and knowledge and the practicing of your faith.
Right.
And repent of that.
So, for instance, for my Catholic friends, how many times do you hear this where somebody goes to a Baptist service or a Presbyterian service and they hear a sermon, a 45-minute sermon on the Bible, and it's like, I've never heard, my priest, I'm lucky if they can even quote the scripture, let alone give me this kind of incredible breakdown. And oh, by the way, the music was so much better. It was so much inspiring, and it was so much better at this Baptist service than it is at my regular church practice. It fed me. It fed something that I've been wanting in my sermons that I don't get from church. So I'm going to convert. Well, okay, from my perspective, I would say you're looking at your weekly mass attendance with a very different perspective than what the church is presenting you. You're wanting something from the mass that the church isn't even attempting to say is supposed to be part of the mass. You're not supposed to be there to just hear the music or to hear a Bible study. You're there for the Eucharist, and vice versa. I would think the other way around. If somebody is Protestant and they go to a mass and suddenly they're overwhelmed by some sort of spiritual feeling because it's a more mystical environment,
sure,
whether it's Orthodox or
more of a high ritual situation, or sometimes interacting with the church fathers for the first time can cause people a lot of ecclesial anxiety if they grew up in sort of megachurch evangelicalism, that they start seeing a real intellectual foundation that was in the church fathers, and then that sort of leads them to the Catholicism path.
Right.
Not recognizing the rich historical history of Protestantism because they were never taught it.
Right.
And so they think, oh, well, the only history is that of in Catholicism. And that's just not true. And there's a lot of broad scholarship that supports that. So just recognize your own limitations that probably brought to this point.
Yeah, and look before you leap. If you're converting for a reason like that, you might want to really, really, really focus and examine the faith that you were raised in, and by the way, the faith that you had when you got married and made a commitment to somebody before you suddenly change such a fundamental thing about who you are. Because put yourself in the position of your spouse. They thought they were marrying one person who had one set of beliefs, and now this is a pretty significant thing to suddenly shift on, right?
Right. And so having a lot of grace for that other person too. But we just don't see anywhere in Scripture where a biblical reason to divorce is someone joining a different ecclesial community that still confesses 1 Corinthians 15. So.
Nor is it, by the way, part of the church's tradition or in the catechism, as well as Scripture. I just want to throw that in there. Also, by the way, along those same lines, if I can say, if you don't mind, and jump in there, if your spouse is going through this existential crisis, for lack of a better word, and they're rethinking their faith, and they're on the verge of, they've done all the homework, and they've really looked at it, and they think, I got to convert because I think that this is the truth, and I can't be dedicated to something that I don't think is true. In my opinion, I don't think you can stand in the way. I don't think you can be the person, if you love that person, if you committed your life to them, you can't throw down an ultimatum, well, if you change religions, if you change churches, then I'm out of here. That's, I think, a pretty negative thing, and I mean, you love this person, you've committed your life to them, and if this is where their heart and their mind and their research and where the Holy Spirit is moving them, you don't want to be a person who's standing in their way. I think they're going to resent you for that. How can they not? So these are obviously complicated and tough things, but and that's a different situation than we had, where we were already committed to our faith before we fell.
Which we can move on to that. So the next stage of life would be one that was essentially the circumstances of our marriage. It is a later stage of life. Future children were not a possibility, and the children that existed were already committed to be raised within a certain ecclesial community. And we had different convictions, and still do. And that takes a lot of wisdom, but we had to talk it through about what it would look like. But I would say if you do not find, if this person is a confessor of Christ and you believe that they are a Christian, then I would say, yes, a later stage of life should be, if you love this person and they're a confessor of Christ, then get married.
I think it makes it easier for sure. I mean, I think that, yeah, I think that I think for us it was easier because we were already pretty rooted in our convictions and our beliefs, and we had a reason to be rooted in our beliefs. Neither of us were really nominal, and we fell in love with each other fully aware of that situation.
Yes.
With full knowledge. It's not like, oh, at the last minute we found this out about each other, right? And so I just think if you're moved to fall in love with somebody, knowing that and being conscious of that and recognizing it, there's a reason for that relationship. There's a reason why you're together and you're called to make it work.
And I would say, like, it's not like that we didn't talk about this before we got married.
Yeah.
It was talked about quite a bit, and we went in eyes wide open on what this would look like. And again, there was no possibility of future children, and our children were already committed to being raised in the faith in a certain ecclesial community. So that discussion was not on the table. But we talked about this before we got married. It was a main center point. And because even going in then, we knew that we were going to be able to have good conversations about this. And this was not going to provoke each other to sin in how we talk to each other about it. That is what really led to it.
By the way, I do want to say this, though, and I don't remember if I had this conversation with you, but I'm pretty sure I had it with your dad.
Mm-hmm.
I actually flew to Oklahoma and asked her parents for her hand in marriage. It's the most terrifying day of my life.
And my mom actually, because I was talking to her about this video, and she told me, because my dad, as we mentioned, was a Southern Baptist minister.
Yeah.
And she told me that while they may have had reservations on that front of us being in different ecclesial communities, in the end, they trusted me. They knew that they had raised me. They knew my faith. So they trusted me.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's funny. I never put myself in your dad's perspective, where or your mom's perspective, that they might think that by marrying a Catholic, that in some way you would be, drawn away from the faith that they raised you in. My perspective was always, oh, are they going to want me to convert to baptism, which they didn't. Although, so anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say, I don't think we ever had this conversation.
No, I don't think so.
She's hearing it now for the first time. But your dad did raise this.
Mm-hmm.
It did, and I explained, and I told them absolutely honestly, and it's still the truth. I said, listen, I'm raised Catholic. I love my Catholic religion. I love my Catholic faith. I know that there are some differences between Meredith's approach to Christianity versus my approach to Christianity through my Catholic faith. But I'm open-minded. I mean, I love Meredith, and I respect her, and I respect everything that made her the person that she is. And if by being exposed to her faith, I'm not closed-minded. If suddenly I say, oh my gosh, that's the way, the truth, and the life, then I would follow it. And I have. I mean, I think I've been. I don't know. You could say. I mean,
sure.
When she says, hey, I want you to watch this, I want you to listen to this, I've totally gone forward with it. I just and again, as I said in our first video, I think that experience has made me a better Catholic, ironically. I don't know if you planned on that, but that's what's ended up happening. But it is important, I think, if you know going in that you believe this and she believes that, you can't be a bullhead. You got to be like, there's a reason why you love this person. So you've got to be open-minded for her to be able to say, hey, this really feeds my soul. This is really informed why I believe what I believe. I want you to see it because I'd love your opinion on it.
Yeah, and that would be, I would say, another point of consideration whenever, if this is somebody who you think you want to spend the rest of your life with. And I would say this falls into anything that maybe you have deep convictions about, whether it's politics or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If that's a discussion that cannot be on the table because you can't talk about it well, I would not suggest marrying that person.
Yep.
If you can't talk about your deep convictions with them without sinning against one another before you're married,
yep,
before the stakes are even higher,
that's a great point.
I would really caution against that. And as I said, I wanted to be transparent at the beginning of this, that how we disagree with each other, and that we are going to get to points of disagreement later, how that has been a muscle that has been worked.
Mm-hmm.
But from the very beginning, we had the ability to talk to each other, and we were willing to talk to each other, and making sure that we were not sinning against one another or being provoked into anger or something like that while we were talking. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that never happens. We've talked about that before. But, you know, if you cannot go into a marriage saying, by the way, this topic is going to be off the table.
Right. Yeah. It's such an important point. I've heard this from people who marry and they have political disagreements, but also faith-based disagreements. Where they say, yeah, that topic's off the table. That topic is off limits. We just don't talk about that. These are things that you care so deeply about. They're so important to you. You don't have to agree, but you got to be able to talk about it.
And again, I want to separate this from the first category of, you know, if you're already married and your spouse converts.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you need to take a break from talking about things, so that way you can approach it better later down the line.
Yeah.
But if you're starting off your marriage where you can't talk about your deeply held convictions, I would say that would be an indication that it might be unwise to pursue the relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. All right. This brings us to...
Yes. So now, I don't know if it's most common, but probably most common for us.
Because we're both surrounded by young people.
We are surrounded by a lot of young people. And it's wonderful that God has put this in our lives, and this is sort of where we're at right now, where we are surrounded by a lot of young single professionals. And many, many people reach out to us whenever they start dating someone who, as Larry said, checks all the boxes,
Mm-hmm.
except one.
Except one. Nothing huge, just, you know, pertaining to our salvation. Yeah, exactly.
The same ecclesial community.
Yeah. Why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll go first. So, I was doing a survey of the Proverbs. I did a friendship seminar recently, and something that I just really saw as going through the Proverbs, and I love Proverbs, and I love Ecclesiastes, and what I see is God has a moral will, and then he shows us also what is wise. And we can make foolish decisions without necessarily sinning, and God shows us what his moral will is, and then he gives us so much wisdom in how to make good decisions as well outside of that, you know, setting aside that moral will whenever we know that it's not sin, but is it wise? And what I saw through Proverbs this last time through when I was looking at friendship is so much of it is not necessarily prescriptive, but descriptive. It is telling you where areas are, you know, you're going to have to work twice as hard. You need to be aware of this. And I think the whole testament of Scripture is that we need to be active in everything. We are active in pursuing holiness. We're not being passive and just not sinning. And that's where I see, that's kind of the foundation of what I'm thinking about when I think about young couples where children are probably in the future. And so I would say, again, not knowing you, in general, I would say it's unwise. What I see is, you know, marriage is hard, and it takes a lot of work, and there are a lot of opportunities for resentment, and things change over time. How you interact with each other changes over time. Things that you thought you would never do, you end up doing. And things that you thought you would do forever, you stop doing. And agreeing, because part of getting married and is agreeing how you're going to raise your children. That has to be part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And putting the stakes of deciding that you're going to raise a child in a different ecclesial community with teaching things that you don't believe is truth in the future. Boy, that's setting up a marriage for a lot of problems, I think. It's putting a lot of strain, because over time, you know, resentment can build, your feelings are going to change. When your child is born and rubber meets the road, you're now committing to something, again, teaching your child things that maybe you don't believe is true. And I just don't think it would be wise.
So this is when Meredith suddenly becomes Anita from West Side Story. Stick to your own kind, one of your own kind.
That was very good.
Thank you very
Pull.
much.
Nice
Thank you.
pull.
She's wrong. She's 100% wrong. I disagree with her. So basically you're saying if you're a young couple and you're dating and you're trying to work it out and you think you're going to get married and one of you is Protestant and one of you is Catholic, you should rethink the whole thing, unless one of you is willing to convert.
I would consider it unwise unless one of you converts.
You would recommend against this.
Yes.
You would recommend. So in other words, if I were a younger man without kids and we had fallen in love, you would have never married me.
If children were possible in the future, yeah.
So, and the children thing seems to be the biggest part.
Yeah, absolutely. It's because of raising your children.
Right. Okay, so I have a different opinion. First of all, I think that there are, if everything else works in the relationship and this is the only thing, then I think that you owe it to yourself to try, not try marriage, but you owe it to yourself to go through some of the things we are talking about in this series, in Bridging the Tiber, to raise these issues, to watch these things together, to say, well, what about you? Because here's what I'm guessing. You haven't talked about a lot of this stuff yet. You haven't seen how these conversations
absolutely.
go. And I don't think you should... I think it would be a tragedy if a guy goes through life, right now, he's in his early to mid, maybe late 20s, and he's ready to settle down. He's finally ready to get married, and he's excluding huge swaths of potential women from even consideration because they're not the right kind of Christian. I think that would be a tragedy. There are young men in our society right now who already have more than enough excuses for not getting married, and to add another one to the mix is irresponsible. We need good young men to marry good young women and raise good young children. And I really think that it would be a tragedy if this is just another reason for you not to get married. Because, young man, you need to settle down and get married.
Well, there is that. Definitely, people should get married. But
I'm not suggesting you're saying they shouldn't get married. But you know what I mean? And so, I think if somebody, like I said, checks all those boxes, then okay, then you need to see if you can, if this one thing that it doesn't work can be overcome, because I think that it can. So really.
Well, let's get into that, because I will tell you that, our previous discussions of this and how you viewed the stakes on this, for a Protestant and a Catholic getting married, really informed me on this as well. So talk about what that looks like then. If they get married, what does it look like for a Catholic to marry the Protestant?
Right.
Like I said, in my ecclesial community, you're welcome at my table, right? Like,
right.
Come to church. We were married in a Southern Baptist church, all that stuff. And that was not required. It was not required for you to convert. That's not the same situation, right?
Right. For a Catholic, it is not required that you convert. What's required is that if you are going to get married in a Catholic church, the non-Catholic spouse must agree to raise the children Catholic.
Okay.
They must agree to raise the children Catholic.
And if you are Catholic and say, you know what, my spouse is not agreeing to that, so we can't get married in a Catholic church, what does that mean for the Catholic in the marriage?
It's a big deal. That means that if you follow the church's teaching, which sadly too many Catholics these days don't, like our president, it means that you are not in communion with the church. It means that your marriage is in, don't take this the wrong way, in the words of the Vatican, in the words of the canon law of the Catholic Church, you are in an invalid marriage. And it means that you are not in communion with the church and that you can't participate in the Mass, in the Eucharist. That's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
I could see how that might build up resentment in a marriage, don't you think?
Well, not if you're grown up and not if you approach it. I recognize that was going to be the situation. And
yeah, but again, I
don't
also say we were in
a
later life stage, right? We were not a young couple
and listen,
that was going to have children.
I'm not saying it's not a big deal. I'm not saying it's not a big deal. But what about on the other hand? What is the downside for the non-Catholic spouse to agree to have the children raised in the Catholic Church?
Right. And
how does that affect you?
Again, I would say that it is you are committing to teach your children things that you don't believe are the truth. And I think that's kind of a big deal. And I mean, we've even seen in our marriage, you know, but Larry is
with
divorced.
our young, our grown-up children, or
right, but even earlier,
right.
Like it was so important for us to have, and there were hard lessons learned. I'm not going to pretend that this was easy or that we did it right from the get-go, but we had to have a united front with the other home that our children were living in.
Yeah, and
so. And that was, you know, and the kids were being raised in the Catholic faith. That was already decided. So imagine, and there was like a multi-home situation. Imagine being in one home, and inside that home, there's disagreement on what the truth is, on what is.
All right. So
that I cannot see that. You know, I'm not saying it never works, but I can't see it as being wise. I can't see it as being wise.
I don't see it as unwise, but I definitely see it as a challenge. And because, listen, I know children who were raised in homes where one parent is Catholic and the other parent is Jewish, and they worked that out. You know, talk about a difference. I mean, a Protestant and a Catholic have much more in common. And I want to let's play this out and how it would work. So we agree to raise the children in the Catholic faith. And the baby is born and the baby is baptized. You don't believe in infant baptism. But, you know, what harm is it? If you don't believe in it, then it's just a ceremony. You don't think it's a real baptism, right? So no harm, no foul. How's that hurting you?
Because again, I'm endorsing things, and I will tell my children things or have my children be taught things that I don't believe is the truth.
Right. Well, so the question is whether but your husband does believe it's the truth.
Right.
And it's very important to him.
Yes. And certainly there are compromises that can be made on that front in other areas. But I'm trying to think about, again, going back to the Proverbs example. So like Proverbs says, like somebody who has a bunch of friends is due for a bunch of strife. And the lesson there is not don't have a bunch of friends. It is recognize that, you know, if you have a bunch of friends, like you need to be active in making sure that your life does not have strife.
Right.
I would say this. Marriage is due to have a lot of opportunities for resentment, to have a lot of opportunities for conflict. So why, and you have to be active in tamping down on that, in pursuing that. Why add something that can only serve to build up strife, and it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have real conflict going forward as the kids grow. Think about couples who have a brand new baby, right? And they say, we're going to do cloth diapers, only the purest cotton, only the most pure organic food. And, you know, they're toddlers and they're wearing stuff from Target and they're eating, you know, chicken nuggets from McDonald's,
because
right?
Things change.
Because things change. And so I think it's putting a lot on a young 20-year-old to say, yes, I am going to seed the very foundation of what my children are going to be taught and expect them to hold on to that for the next 10 years.
Well,
you know, that's a lot.
I think what you do in that case, and again, this has to do with how important, listen, if it is the most important thing and you can't possibly conceive of it, well, then that's a problem. But wouldn't it be sad if this keeps you from marrying the person that you were meant to be? And what happens if you can't find anybody else in your life that is the ideal husband, like that poor Catholic guy that is now, you know, unable to marry?
Well,
we have a challenge right now in our society of people having good, healthy, strong marriages. And I don't know. I truly believe that if you focus on raising your children in the same way we have focused on having our marriage, and instead of dwelling on the things that you don't agree with, those few things that you don't agree with in the way your child is being raised as a Christian, but you do focus on the things you do agree with, And your child is going to grow up knowing their mother is the holiest, most wonderful, loving, gracious Christian woman that they have ever met. And oh, by the way, if she's not Catholic, well, maybe that says something about non-Catholic Christians in our society, doesn't it? And that's going to be one of the most loving, wonderful Catholic young child that you've ever raised.
Right. Well, I would hesitate to limit the sovereignty of God just because you decide not to marry someone based on having very deep ecclesial differences. God is faithful, and also marriage is not the end of all being. The end of all being is the chief end of man is to glorify God, and that might be through singleness. But so marriage is not the end all be all. And so if that is what happens, that you decide not to marry someone because of deep ecclesial differences, and you're single for the rest of your life, then that you will glorify God in that. But I would also say that, again, you're asking someone to commit to something in raising children, and before they've had them. And a lot of things change. And as those children get older and they start asking questions, presenting a united front, even when everybody agrees with the same thing, is kind of difficult, right?
Well, listen, again, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying it's not difficult, but I also think that it shouldn't. Do you think that? How do I want to say this? Don't you think that presenting, having this picture of multiple deep beliefs in the home can serve to confuse children? Can serve to sort of make it more difficult for them to believe in absolute truth? No, I think it depends on how it's done and what's presented to the children, because I think that there is, I'll ask you about our kids. Mm-hmm. Do you think fundamentally our children know the distinction, without doing a theological or historical deep dive into the Reformation? Do you think that our kids, as they were growing up, knew really the distinction between your Baptist faith and our Catholic faith?
Well, we didn't go too far into it. The kids never came to church with me.
Right.
And that was all by design. But I will say, I think we have talked about how sometimes we presented issues to them perhaps a little too neutrally, right? We didn't always...
Well, did it ever come up? And I mean, setting aside whether you go to the church or not, just in terms of how we interact with each other in the household, or, if there was discipline involved, or if there was some sort of discussion that we had to have with our children.
Yeah, I would also say in our context, because I was the step parent, there were maybe some things there that would not make it come up. Like, the kids aren't going to be as necessarily interested in what I was doing as as their own birth mother in their home and things like that, right? We had different relational things going on that maybe
that's fair.
That
wouldn't be in another situation.
It wasn't necessarily, the curiosity wasn't there. There was a lot of other stuff going on. So,
but I just think as a child gets older,
I find it hard to believe that a child being raised in a two-parent home, that they're not going to start asking questions, and parents are going to quickly have to figure out how to present what is true whenever they don't even agree on certain things, on very deep convictions on what is true.
Absolutely, but I think that it's...
But we would agree that a child needs to have, maybe a singular message, certainly early, on what the truth is.
Definitely, early on. But thankfully, I think that early on, there's, again, fundamental truths that we agree on, that when a child is 5 years old, I don't think at 5 years old there's a whole lot of difference between the basic fundamentals of Catholic Christianity.
When's First Communion?
8 years old, 7 years old, 7 or 8 years old.
All right, so pretty early, where we're going to have probably some deeper, depending on your ecclesial community. You're going to have some deeper issues. Certainly we're coming at this from a Southern Baptist, low ritual church perspective, very regulatory principle perspective on my part. So our ecclesial communities and how they present and in what they believe is very different. maybe a Catholic and an Anglican. This is not as...
Or Lutheran?
Yeah.
Or Catholic and Orthodox?
It's maybe not quite as far apart as ours are in presentation and in theology. But I struggle with advising this to people that I don't know. Again, if I know you and I ask a bunch of questions, I might give you a different answer than this. But for strangers out there that are thinking about this, I say with the future of children, with a possibility of children in the future, I don't see how this is wise.
Well, Jimmy, we Catholics believe that at communion time, that's the real presence of Jesus' body and blood. But at Mommy's church, they think it's something a little bit different. Mommy, why don't you tell Jimmy what you think it is at communion time?
Again, and children need absolute truth. They need clarity. And having those things very different in the home, I again, don't consider it wise.
Well,
but
Jimmy, Daddy's family thinks the Michigan Wolverines are the greatest college football team of all time. They have the winningest record, and no team comes close. But Mommy's family, they think the Oklahoma Sooners are the best football team.
And by the way, none of those things are essential to salvation. So
you've never seen a game in Michigan. To bring you to Ann Arbor. I was saved in Ann Arbor once. It's a long story.
Anyway. Any other thoughts?
There you go. Happy? We disagreed on something. Happy now? Happy? Marry that woman, young man. Get over it. Fix it. I'll never forget. Let me end you with this. My very good friend Hugh Hewitt, who is a radio host, he's in a very...
I'm hoping that he might be our first interview. He and his wife.
Well, so what happened was he fell in love with he was raised Catholic, and he fell in love with a non-Catholic Christian woman, and but they fell in love and they made it work, and they did not get married in the Catholic Church. Hugh deferred and said and got married in his wife's church, and he said, let's figure out what because they had to figure out what church to go to, and when they were raising their kids, and I think he still goes to Catholic church on Saturday night at the vigil, and then attended church when raising the children on Sunday morning, and he said, we got to go to a Christian church, whichever Christian church where there is the least likelihood of me being hugged by a stranger, that's the church we're going to pick. And they did. I think it was Presbyterian. Do Presbyterians hug? They don't seem like the hugging type.
Depends.
Anyway.